You have never known panic until you watch a billion-dollar tech empire evaporate over a single layoff. They considered me a 32-year-old expense easily erased to polish a quarterly report. But firing the only person holding the quantum keys to the United States drone network is not just cutting costs. It is triggering a national security bomb. Let me tell you how I burned down a glass tower with silence. Hello and welcome to all the dedicated listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization features, leaving our channel completely without the necessary budget to continue operating normally. If you enjoy our content and find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you will gain access to exclusive, true stories that are even more incredible, featuring longer runtimes, deeper and more intricate details that we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all brought to life by a cast of highly emotional voice actors. You can easily become a member by scanning the Patreon QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you so much for your support. And now, let us dive into the story of Isla Ross. My name is Isla Ross. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I was a cryptography compliance expert trained by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, commonly known as DARPA. My place of employment was Meridian Horizon Dynamics, a colossal aerospace technology corporation headquartered in Seattle. To the casual observer, I was just another mid-level desk jockey collecting a paycheck in a sprawling corporate hive. But my true value was distinctly unique. I was not merely an employee logging hours. I was the absolute bottleneck for the most sensitive government project on the Western Seaboard. I possessed a Level 5 Special Access Program clearance. Out of the thousands of brilliant engineers and wealthy executives swarming the Seattle campus, I was the only individual holding that specific classification, on the official Pentagon ledgers locked away in Washington. I was designated as the sole legal code custodian for a highly classified next-generation stealth drone initiative. Without my direct cryptographic signature, not a single line of flight software could be legally uploaded to the military hardware. I was the gatekeeper holding the keys to the kingdom. For years, Meridian functioned perfectly under this strict regulatory framework. Then, the board of directors decided the company needed a modern facelift. Enter Braxton Hayes, the newly appointed Chief Efficiency Officer. Braxton was a 34-year-old embodiment of toxic Silicon Valley hustle culture. He was a prime example of a tech bro, radiating unearned arrogance and wearing designer shoes that cost more than my monthly rent. His primary claim to fame before joining our aerospace firm was steering a cryptocurrency startup straight into bankruptcy. Yet, he had convinced our board that his disruptive mindset was exactly what a defense contractor needed. Braxton was profoundly obsessed with utilizing artificial intelligence to automate complex processes and relentlessly focused on replacing highly skilled human expertise with cheap algorithms. While Braxton was busy disrupting the executive suites, I maintained my quiet, lethal routine. My office was a cramped, windowless room located deep within the secure subterranean sector of the building. My daily fuel consisted of nothing but black coffee. My primary job description essentially revolved around saying no. I spent countless hours meticulously reviewing and subsequently rejecting the insecure, sloppy code written by impulsive young developers who valued deployment speed over national security. I was the invisible shield keeping the company from being unceremoniously stripped of its multi-billion-dollar Department of Defense contracts. The development teams hated me for it, constantly complaining about my rigid standards, but my unwavering meticulousness was the only thing keeping the company executives out of federal prison. It did not take long for Braxton to set his sights on my department. He began hosting mandatory, company-wide presentations filled with flashy graphics and empty corporate buzzwords. Pacing the stage with a wireless microphone, he would loudly declare that rigorous military security protocols were nothing more than the sluggishness of an old era. "We are moving entirely too slowly," Braxton announced during one particularly agonizing town hall meeting. We need to break things and innovate. The bureaucratic red tape of the past is stifling our potential and eating into our margins. He then proudly unveiled his grand vision to the staff, a comprehensive plan to cut 20% of the personnel budget by the end of the fiscal quarter. He promised the board that artificial intelligence could easily handle the complex compliance checks that human teams were currently managing. He looked directly at the secure engineering division when he said it, his smug smile broadcasting exactly who he intended to eliminate. What Braxton completely failed to understand was the intricate web of federal safeguards surrounding our specific project. He saw me merely as an expensive line item on a spreadsheet. He had zero knowledge of the Zero Trust Lockdown Protocol. The Zero Trust Lockdown was a deeply classified Department of Defense fail-safe. It was a digital dead man switch designed specifically to prevent enemy infiltration. If the official code custodian, which was me, was ever forcibly removed, terminated, or disconnected from the encrypted server network without a highly rigorous military handover process, the system would immediately react. It would automatically freeze all connected global military devices, turning state-of-the-art stealth drones worth hundreds of millions of dollars into completely useless piles of metal. It was a lethal digital booby trap, and within the shiny glass walls of Meridian, no one besides me knew it even existed. Braxton was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between a software bug and a national security crisis. The storm finally broke on a typical Tuesday morning when Braxton rolled out his master plan for the drone fleet. He completely bypassed the entire research and development division and purchased a ridiculously cheap, open-source navigation software package. He intended to rip out our highly secure, heavily encrypted proprietary navigation system and replace it with this bargain bin code downloaded from a public repository. His rationale was brilliantly simple in his own mind. He proudly announced to the executive board that this single decisive move would save the company exactly $50 million in development and maintenance costs over the next fiscal year. The only catch was that he needed my department to rubber stamp the compliance documents immediately, so the software integration could begin before the end of the month. I ran the proposed open source code through our initial sandbox environment, and it was an absolute nightmare of epic proportions. It was riddled with glaring vulnerabilities that a high school computer science student could exploit on their lunch break. I immediately drafted a comprehensive, glowing red flag report. I meticulously documented exactly 14 fatal security flaws hard-coded into the fundamental architecture of the software. Any single one of those vulnerabilities would allow a moderately skilled foreign hacker to bypass the firewalls, overwrite the targeting parameters, and completely hijack our stealth drones mid-flight. I marched straight into Braxton's massive glass-walled suite, dropped the printed 50-page report directly onto his pristine mahogany desk, and flatly refused to sign the authorization. I looked him in the eye and told him that deploying this unverified software on active military hardware was not just grossly negligent. It bordered on outright treason. Braxton did not appreciate being told no by a subordinate, especially one he deemed obsolete. Exactly 2 days later, he scheduled a mandatory company-wide video conference. With over 2,000 employees tuned in from their desks and home offices, he decided to make a very public example out of me. He did not specifically mention my name at first, but the target on my back was painfully obvious to anyone who knew the dynamics of the defense contracts. He stood in front of a digital whiteboard, sleeves rolled up in classic startup fashion, and loudly complained about the parasitic conservatives lurking within the compliance department. "We have certain individuals in this company who are nothing more than institutional roadblocks," Braxton declared to the camera, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "They are desperately clinging to outdated methodologies. They are terrified of true innovation because it directly threatens their cozy, irrelevant jobs. Meridian Horizon Dynamics simply cannot afford to be held hostage by the fear of the old guard. We must trim the fat to sprint towards the future." The internal purge began shortly after that broadcast ended. The senior engineering team, the seasoned veterans who actually understood the immense gravity of building lethal weapons for the federal government, were systematically targeted and dismantled. The lead engineers who consistently backed my rigorous security assessments were suddenly transferred to dead-end legacy projects or quietly pushed into taking early retirement packages. To replace them, Braxton brought in a massive wave of fresh-faced interns and junior developers straight out of intensive coding boot camps. They were thrilled to be working in aerospace, desperate to prove themselves, and completely eager to please the new management. They did not possess nearly enough experience to question the structural integrity of the open-source software, and they were more than happy to just smile, nod enthusiastically, and execute Braxton's reckless orders without a second thought. I did not waste a single breath arguing with the new regime. Shouting matches in sterile corporate hallways never win wars. Instead, I retreated to my windowless office and quietly weaponized the federal bureaucracy against them. I accessed the secure military portal, a highly classified system entirely segregated from Meridian's internal corporate network. I spent 5 hours meticulously updating the internal risk warning logs of the Department of Defense. I officially attached my red flag report, detailed the 14 critical vulnerabilities, and permanently documented my explicit refusal to authorize the open-source integration. It was a tedious, purely bureaucratic maneuver, but it was also my ironclad insurance policy. When the inevitable catastrophe finally struck, those time-stamped federal logs would be the exact undeniable evidence required to shield me from federal prosecution. I was carefully building an impenetrable fortress of paper, while Braxton was busily constructing a fragile house of cards. The workplace tension reached a volatile breaking point when Braxton officially revoked my calendar access to all upcoming project integration meetings. He effectively exiled the sole code custodian from the very defense project I was legally mandated by the Pentagon to oversee. Word quickly reached me through a highly sympathetic IT technician that Braxton was incredibly confident he had found a clever technical workaround. He genuinely believed he could utilize a new generative artificial intelligence program to automatically forge the complex compliance certificates. He honestly thought he could command a chatbot to generate legal documents that looked official enough to fool the seasoned Pentagon auditors, completely bypassing my legal authority and pushing his $50 million cost-saving measure through the pipeline. He was arrogantly playing a high-stakes game of chicken with the United States military, and he had proudly blindfolded himself before slamming his foot on the gas pedal. The inevitable axe finally fell on a remarkably bleak Tuesday afternoon. The Seattle sky was a bruised, heavy gray, unleashing a torrential downpour that violently battered the panoramic windows of the Meridian Horizon Dynamics headquarters. I was staring at a complex line of encryption logic when a stark, urgent notification flashed across my monitor. It was a calendar invite from Human Resources, scheduling a mandatory sync in exactly 5 minutes. The location was Conference Room Alpha, a sterile, highly visible glass box situated right in the center of the executive floor. It was the designated slaughterhouse for corporate executions, designed intentionally to let the rest of the staff watch the victims walk the Green Mile. I locked my terminal and took the elevator up, my pulse steady and my breathing measured. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, I found Braxton sitting at the head of the polished oak table. He was leaning back in his ergonomic chair, steepled fingers resting beneath his chin, wearing a thoroughly practiced smirk. Next to him sat a brand-new Human Resources representative, a young woman who looked incredibly uncomfortable, nervously clutching a sleek tablet and a manila folder. The air in the room was overly conditioned, chillingly cold, and entirely devoid of any professional respect. Without offering a greeting, Braxton casually slid a single sheet of paper across the expanse of the smooth table. It stopped precisely at the edge, right in front of me. "We are going in a different direction," Braxton announced, his tone dripping with mock sympathy that barely masked his utter triumph. "The board has mandated a comprehensive organizational optimization. We are streamlining our operational efficiency, and unfortunately, your role has been identified as a redundancy in our new Agile framework. Today will be your final day at Meridian." I did not touch the piece of paper. I merely looked at him, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his ignorance. Braxton could not resist twisting the knife, eager to assert his dominance. "If it makes you feel any better, your salary is going to a much better cause," he added, a cruel chuckle escaping his lips. "Freeing up your $180,000 compensation package allows us to finally hire a dedicated TikTok marketing team. We need to focus on brand synergy and viral engagement, not archaic compliance paranoia." The human resources representative flinched slightly at his unprofessional cruelty, but she remained entirely silent. They were both waiting for a reaction. They expected me to argue, to demand an explanation, or perhaps to break down in tears and beg for my livelihood. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the stubborn gatekeeper crumble. Instead, my expression remained completely frozen. I maintained absolute, unblinking eye contact with Braxton, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocatingly heavy. When I finally spoke, my voice was devoid of any emotion, as detached and cold as the rain lashing against the glass behind him. "Have you designated a replacement special access program custodian on the Department of Defense server system yet?" I asked calmly. Braxton blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the highly specific, deeply technical question. Then, his signature arrogance returned in full force. He threw his head back and let out a loud, dismissive laugh, waving his hand in the air as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "We are not worrying about that pointless paperwork right now," Braxton scoffed, shaking his head at my apparent inability to grasp his visionary priorities. "The information technology boys will handle whatever legacy administrative forms need to be updated. I have an artificial intelligence script ready to automate all of those outdated regulatory filings by next week anyway. You just focus on packing your desk." "Understood," I replied simply. I reached down, carefully folded the termination notice exactly in half, and slipped it into my blazer pocket. I stood up, pushed my chair back in, and walked out of the glass room without uttering another syllable. I did not look back at them. I descended back to my subterranean, windowless office for the very last time. I sat down at my heavily fortified terminal and authenticated my identity using my biometric credentials and my physical security token. I navigated through the labyrinth of classified military directories until I reached the core quantum encryption portal of the Pentagon. There, buried deep within the system architecture, was a stark, unassuming digital interface. I navigated to my personal authorization profile. I moved the cursor over a bold, red command button labeled Custodian Separated. I did not hesitate. I clicked the mouse. A secondary prompt appeared, demanding my final cryptographic signature to confirm that I was permanently relinquishing my mandate. I typed in my sequence and hit Enter. The screen flashed green for a fraction of a second before immediately locking me out of the military network forever. The action was entirely silent, but in the digital realm, I had just pulled the pin on a massive grenade. I picked up my empty ceramic coffee mug and slipped my heavy bronze DARPA challenge coin into my pocket. Those were the only two personal items I cared to take. I left the expensive monitors, the ergonomic keyboard, and the stacks of ignored security reports right where they were. I walked out of the building and stepped into the heavy Seattle rain. Breathing in the sharp, clean air, I felt completely liberated. Behind me, locked inside the server rooms of a company that thought they were untouchable, a silent, invisible 48-hour countdown had officially begun to flash violently across the restricted military network. I spent the entirety of my first official day of unemployment exactly how I had always fantasized. I drove out early, loaded my kayak, and launched into the freezing, crystal-clear waters of Lake Washington. The morning air was crisp and smelled of heavy pine and fresh rain. The Seattle skyline loomed in the far distance, a jagged collection of steel and glass where I used to spend my life trapped in a windowless bunker. Now, the only sound was the gentle, rhythmic splash of my paddle cutting through the quiet waves. I left my primary cellular phone turned completely off, sealed safely inside a waterproof bag. I deliberately disconnected from the relentless hum of the corporate machine. The absolute silence out on the water was profoundly beautiful. It was the peaceful calm before a manufactured hurricane. While I was peacefully gliding across the lake, breathing in the freedom, the catastrophic chain reaction finally breached the surface at Meridian Horizon Dynamics. The disaster did not begin with a massive explosion, but rather with a series of chilling, undeniable ripples. Deep in the scorching sands of the Nevada testing facility, three colossal matte black prototype drones were undergoing routine pre-flight diagnostics. These magnificent machines were collectively valued at over $400 million, representing the absolute pinnacle of stealth aviation. Without warning, their internal telemetry systems simply died. The massive mechanical beasts completely shut down, dropping their heavy wings as if their digital lifeblood had been instantaneously drained. Inside the remote control bunkers back in Seattle, the massive panoramic monitors went pitch black for one agonizing minute. When the screens finally flickered back to life, all the complex tactical data had vanished. It was replaced by a single, glaringly bright red diagnostic error message that covered every inch of the displays. It read, "Custodian absent, access denied." The control room descended into immediate chaos, and Braxton Hayes was urgently paged. He strutted onto the secure operations floor holding a fresh cup of artisan coffee, looking profoundly irritated that his morning synergy meeting had been interrupted. He stood before the bank of flashing red monitors, staring at the critical lockdown warnings, because he possessed zero fundamental understanding of military-grade encryption. He looked at the Pentagon's impenetrable quantum security barrier and saw nothing more than a temporary software glitch. He arrogantly turned to the room full of terrified, inexperienced junior engineers. "Just do a force restart," Braxton commanded them, waving his hand dismissively. "Flush the cache, bypass the firewall protocols, and reboot the mainframes. Treat the damn thing like a frozen laptop and get those machines back online now." The junior developers, desperate to appease their demanding new boss and completely oblivious to the legal boundaries they were crossing, blindly followed his incredibly reckless order. They frantically typed in the administrative override commands, attempting to aggressively muscle their way past a highly classified federal defense network. That single, deliberate act of forceful interference was the ultimate trigger. The military architecture did not recognize their frantic keystrokes as a technical troubleshooting attempt. It instantly categorized the forceful bypass as a hostile cyber attack originating from within a contracted facility. The very second that unauthorized reboot command hit the external servers, it triggered a massive, blaring red alert at the headquarters of the National Security Agency in Maryland. The systemic response was breathtakingly fast. Automated government algorithms immediately flagged Meridian as an active security threat, sending shockwaves through the financial sector. Within 20 minutes, the New York Stock Exchange officially intervened. The massive digital trading boards completely halted all transactions of Meridian Horizon Dynamics stock, slapping a temporary suspension across their ticker symbol due to unprecedented and highly unusual market activity. Up in the lavish executive suites of the Seattle Tower, the chief executive officer watched his company's value freeze in real time. Before he could even summon his financial advisors, his secure private landlines began to ring incessantly. On the other end of those phones were several furiously shouting, 4-star military generals. They were practically tearing the phone cords out of the walls, aggressively demanding to know exactly why their entire classified experimental aviation fleet had suddenly transformed into very expensive, highly classified paperweights sitting dead in the desert. The chief executive officer, completely blind to the efficiency measures implemented on the lower floors, screamed for answers that nobody in the executive suite could provide. Down in the operations center, the horrifying reality of the situation finally pierced through Braxton's thick skull. The arrogant smirk entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a sickening pale dread as he watched the corporate stock freeze and the military warnings multiply. In a state of pure, unadulterated panic, he sprinted back to his luxurious office and slammed the door. He frantically dialed my personal cell phone number over and over again, leaving increasingly unhinged, begging voicemails that went straight to my turned-off device. He hammered out dozens of urgent, misspelled emails, desperately offering massive financial bonuses and an immediate reinstatement to my former position. But every single one of those digital cries for help was entirely useless. Each frantic message he sent instantly bounced back to him, accompanied by a cold, automated administrative failure notice. He was desperately trying to send a lifeline to a corporate inbox that he himself had proudly and permanently deleted just 24 hours prior. The digital grave he had so eagerly dug for me had become his own inescapable prison. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of that glass conference room, the invisible countdown clock buried deep within the Pentagon servers struck 0. The Zero Trust lockdown protocol did not simply activate, it detonated. The initial freeze in the Nevada desert had merely been a localized warning shot. This was the main event, across the globe, on naval aircraft carriers stationed in the Pacific Ocean and at highly classified forward operating bases in Eastern Europe. Every single piece of military hardware running Meridian Horizon Dynamics software received the termination signal simultaneously. The security protocol was absolutely ruthless. It did not just pause the operating systems, it initiated an aggressive, automated self-destruct sequence targeting the core control partitions of the software. Millions of lines of proprietary code were systematically shredded into meaningless digital dust within a matter of seconds. Entire fleets of advanced tactical aircraft, submarine tracking buoys, and orbital satellite communication arrays were instantly rendered completely inoperable. Over $7 billion worth of cutting-edge defense contracts froze solid, transforming into the most expensive scrap metal on the planet. Inside the towering Seattle headquarters, the atmosphere abruptly morphed from a localized panic into a full-blown, apocalyptic meltdown. Braxton Hayes was no longer strutting around the executive suites. He was drowning in his own manufactured catastrophe. The terrified chief executive officer was demanding a complete resolution by the end of the hour. Completely unaware of the sheer magnitude of the systemic failure, Braxton knew with absolute certainty that his career, his unearned wealth, and his precious reputation were exactly seconds away from total vaporization. In a state of pure, suffocating desperation, Braxton made the most spectacularly stupid decision in the history of corporate America. He decided to double down on his own staggering ignorance, realizing that his internal team of inexperienced coding bootcamp graduates were completely incapable of bypassing the quantum walls. He locked himself inside his corner office and accessed a heavily encrypted dark web browser. He reached out to a notorious syndicate of black hat hackers based overseas. He recklessly authorized an illegal wire transfer of exactly $500,000 in untraceable funds, begging these digital mercenaries to brute force their way into the United States military network. His instructions were completely delusional. He ordered them to manually hack the Pentagon and restore the missing compliance certificates before the board of directors figured out what he had done. He actually believed he could quietly break into a federal defense grid, clean up his colossal mess, and pretend none of this ever happened. The hired hackers launched a massive, coordinated, distributed denial of service attack. They aggressively masked a highly sophisticated intrusion worm designed to pry open the severed connection ports. But they were not attacking a fragile commercial bank or a weak corporate firewall. They were throwing digital pebbles at a heavily fortified, quantum-encrypted fortress constructed by the most paranoid and brilliant minds at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The automated defense grid of the United States military did not merely block the intrusion attempt. The moment the foreign code touched the outer perimeter of the military firewall, the digital backlash was instantaneous. The Pentagon servers analyzed the malicious code, traced the origin vectors, and identified the highly aggressive nature of the breach. Because the attack was specifically targeting classified drone control mainframes and was directly routed through the compromised administrative ports of Meridian Horizon Dynamics, the threat assessment algorithms made a terrifying calculation. The Department of Defense no longer viewed this situation as a civil contract dispute or a simple software glitch. The automated systems immediately reclassified the event. The violation was officially escalated from a standard corporate compliance failure to an active, coordinated act of national security cyber terrorism originating from domestic soil. While the highest echelons of the federal government were desperately mobilizing tactical cyber divisions and preparing federal arrest warrants, I was standing comfortably in my quiet kitchen. The evening was incredibly peaceful. I was pouring myself a generous glass of a rather expensive red wine, enjoying the soft jazz playing from my smart speaker. I took a slow sip, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue, relishing the utter tranquility of being completely unemployed. Suddenly, a heavy, rugged, encrypted mobile phone resting on my granite countertop began to vibrate violently. It was a secure device I had not used in over 3 years. I picked it up and pressed the green button. "It is done." A gravelly voice spoke through the heavily encrypted line. It was my former mentor, a senior director at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. "Your former employer just tried to hire foreign mercenaries to smash through the zero-trust architecture. Homeland Security just elevated the threat level to maximum. Meridian Horizon Dynamics just dug themselves a grave so deep they will never see sunlight again. I assume you are enjoying the show." "I am having a lovely evening," I replied, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "Thank you for the update. I will keep my schedule open for the fallout." I disconnected the secure line and took another highly satisfying sip of wine, picturing the absolute chaos unfolding downtown. Back at the Meridian Tower, the board of directors had hurriedly convened an emergency, all hands meeting in the Supreme Executive Boardroom. The chief executive officer was completely unhinged. His face was a deep, alarming shade of purple as he screamed so loudly, his voice echoed through the reinforced walls. He had finally been fully briefed by his frantic legal team about the existence of the Special Access Program and the catastrophic reality of the Code Custodian mandate. "Find Isla Ross right this exact second," the chief executive officer roared, slamming both of his fists down onto the massive mahogany table so hard the coffee cups rattled. "Offer her 5 times her original salary. Give her my personal parking spot. Give her stock options. I do not care what it takes. You get her on the phone and you bring her back into this building immediately before the federal government shuts us down forever." The head of Human Resources, trembling uncontrollably, frantically opened her laptop to pull up my emergency contact file. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking exactly like a ghost. She stared at the screen in pure, unadulterated horror. In his petty, vindictive rush to erase my entire existence from the corporate structure the day he fired me, Braxton had personally ordered the Information Technology Department to permanently purge all of my personal data from the Human Resources database. My phone numbers, my personal email addresses, my emergency contacts, and even my home address had been entirely wiped clean from the corporate servers. They had absolutely no physical or digital way to reach me. "She is gone," the Human Resources Director whispered, her voice cracking in absolute terror. "Mr. Hayes ordered her file permanently deleted. We have no contact information on record." The chief executive officer slowly turned his head to look at Braxton. The silence in the boardroom was absolutely deafening, heavy with the realization of impending doom. Braxton sat frozen in his ergonomic chair, sweating profusely, trembling as he realized that he had just handed a multi-billion-dollar empire a terminal death sentence out of sheer, arrogant spite. Before the chief executive officer could utter another word, the deafening blare of the building-wide emergency alarm shattered the silence. Down on the main operational floors, absolute pandemonium erupted. The automated public address system announced that the facility was experiencing a critical security override. Employees began screaming and wildly scrambling out of their cubicles, desperately throwing their laptops, personal photographs, and coats into cardboard boxes. They did not know exactly what was happening, but the sheer, palpable panic was entirely contagious. The chaos reached a terrifying crescendo when the massive glass security turnstiles in the main lobby suddenly flashed crimson red and locked shut with a loud, metallic clank. The heavy steel emergency shutters began slamming down over the ground floor windows, sealing the exits. The federal government was not just shutting down the software remotely, they were taking complete physical control of the entire facility. The United States government had officially seized the building, trapping the arrogant executives inside the very glass tower they had just burned to the ground. The flashing red lights of the lockdown were suddenly overpowered by the blinding strobe of federal law enforcement. A heavily armored convoy of matte black sport utility vehicles belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cyber Division violently breached the pristine corporate plaza. They slammed on their brakes right in front of the main entrance, heavily armed agents pouring out and moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They did not bother asking the terrified receptionists for access. They possessed the highest-level federal warrants, and they used heavy breaching tools to shatter the locked executive security doors. The agents swarmed the building, marching straight up to the top floor. They systematically raided the secure server rooms, violently ripping cables from the walls and physically seizing every single hard drive. Another tactical team stormed directly into Braxton Hayes's luxurious corner office. They confiscated his custom-built computer, his expensive tablet, and physically ripped his personal mobile phone straight out of his trembling hands. The sheer cinematic satisfaction of the moment was absolute. Braxton Hayes, the arrogant tech bro who thought he could outsmart the United States military to pad a quarterly financial report, was aggressively forced face down onto his custom Italian leather sofa. The metallic click of heavy federal handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed loudly through the executive suite. The agents hauled him to his feet and marched him out. They paraded him straight through the center of the chaotic lobby, right past hundreds of his stunned, panicking employees. His expensive designer suit was rumpled, his face was entirely flushed, and he was openly weeping. He was sobbing uncontrollably, begging the stoic federal agents to understand that it was just a simple cost-cutting measure. He was finally realizing that the ultimate price for his ruthless corporate efficiency was a mandatory minimum federal prison sentence for high treason and cyber terrorism. While Braxton was being shoved into the back of a heavily armored federal transport, I was not sitting at home frantically updating my resume or fielding desperate calls from rival technology firms. Instead, a sleek, unmarked government vehicle arrived quietly at my personal residence. I was escorted directly to a highly classified Department of Defense administrative facility tucked away in a heavily guarded sector of Seattle. I was not brought in to be interrogated. I was brought in to be crowned. The commanding military officers and federal regulators waiting for me inside the secure briefing room did not mince words. The Pentagon had rapidly authorized the creation of a brand new, highly authoritative position, and they immediately appointed me as the Federal Inspector General of Aerospace Compliance. My new mandate was breathtakingly simple and intensely satisfying. My sole professional responsibility was to personally oversee the complete and total legal dissolution of Meridian Horizon Dynamics. I was given absolute authority to strip away every single one of their classified contracts, liquidate their advanced research divisions, and redistribute their massive defense projects to more competent, highly secure government contractors. Sitting at my new, incredibly solid mahogany desk on my first official day as Inspector General, my secure government communication line blinked. It was a heavily routed, desperately transferred voicemail from the now entirely powerless board of directors at Meridian. The chief executive officer sounded as if he was on the verge of a massive cardiac event. His voice was trembling violently as he practically begged me to come back. He frantically promised to pay me absolutely any price I named. He offered me a massive percentage of corporate equity, an executive title, and immediate termination of anyone I disliked. If I would only sign the compliance forms and make the federal agents leave their building. I listened to the entire frantic recording with a soft, cold smile resting on my face. The absolute desperation in his voice was the perfect soundtrack to my morning. When the agonizing message finally concluded, I calmly pressed the delete button, erasing his pathetic pleas into the digital void. I then picked up a heavy black fountain pen and pulled the final executive order toward me. I smoothly and deliberately signed my name, permanently and irrevocably revoking the military operational licenses of Meridian Horizon Dynamics. Braxton Hayes had gleefully destroyed my career because he was absolutely desperate to save $180,000 in annual salary. His profound ignorance and sheer arrogance ended up costing him his personal freedom, and it completely vaporized a $4 billion technology empire overnight. Silence, as it turns out, is the most destructive weapon of all. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and listened to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story incredibly satisfying and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our most exclusive, jaw-dropping true stories that are far too intense and detailed to ever be published on YouTube. You can simply scan the Patreon QR code right now on your screen, or use the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you for your amazing support, and I will see you in the next story.